that, buddy? That's not good.
The Battle of the Crater, according to Grant, was one of the saddest things I have ever witnessed.
Like many battles fought during the horrific American Civil War, this 1864 battle was a bloody one. This battle was very rare, however, in how it was modeled and executed. For many historians and researchers, it is an interesting topic to dive into. Sadly, similar to other battles witnessed during this conflict, however, this battle did not have to be as bloody as it did transpire to be. Stupidity at the leadership level under Burnside's 9th Corps, General Grant and other leaders, political correctness of the day, failure to follow through with a proper assault after the explosion, and the fog of war all doomed many federal troops that summer day. The Battle of the Crater, also known as the Battle of the Mine, was a fight tied into the Richmond-Petersburg campaign. Both sides during the Battle of the Crater utilized trench warfare tactics, which made more sense than one could imagine due to the high casualty rates of the Napoleonic style of fighting elsewhere during most of the war. The fighting in 1864 became a stalemate, and lines were drawn in earthworks, similar to what would be seen much later on in Europe during the Great War beginning in 1914. The Federals back in the summer of 1864 were to ingeniously dig literally underneath the Confederate feet in an attempt to blow the ground out from under them. An unorthodox Union colonel implemented his civilian career experiences as a Pennsylvania coal mine engineer to benefit his troops by digging a mine tunnel under the enemy. This was a carefully planned tunnel, however, complete with ventilation apparatus for the diggers. The tunnel was even propped up with timbering to help prevent dirt cave-ins and subsidence. Even though the Union had an innovative, groundbreaking tactic initially for breaking the Petersburg siege, their plan met the fog of war. The Union leadership initially thought the plan was never going to make it off of the ground. When the Federal leadership saw that the troops were taking it upon themselves to dig the tunnel without help from their superiors, they were impressed. The Federal leadership still had their doubts, however, and allowed the troops to continue digging so they could occupy themselves. Petersburg, Virginia was important in the first place because a Confederate rail center there made it a supply hub for the rebel military. If the attack had worked out in a Union victory, the Petersburg siege, several months old by the time of the Battle of the Crater, would have been broken, and another 8 months of fighting would not have transpired. The siege would not end quickly due to the debacle of the Battle of the Crater. The war would drag on longer now due to this Northern Army loss, and more casualties would mount by the day for both sides. The rebels knew that they had to give it their all and defend their beloved Virginia from Federal troops. This was their homeland after all. Their families and way of life hung in the balance in the summer of 1864. Humiliating defeats and the grind of the war were taking their toll on the battered Confederates by this point. The siege of Petersburg lasted 10 months, and it took its toll, not just emotionally, but even supply-wise on the battered Southerners. The Federals eventually encircled Petersburg, Virginia, but the Confederates were trying to wear out their enemies both on the fighting level and political level. The tunnel answer was to be the North's salvation from this stalemate mess. The tunnel construction was crude in nature, but thorough and brilliantly constructed by the determined and careful Northern troops. Men from the hard coal anthracite region of Pennsylvania, Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania to be exact, first envisioned the mine tunnel idea. Lieutenant Colonel Henry C. Pleasance of the 48th Pennsylvania Infantry led these coal miners in construction of the tunnel. The men began digging the drift, which is a tunnel that slopes slightly upward towards the surface so gravity will drain the tunnel of any water that will enter its workings. The tunnel is not a shaft, by any stretch of the imagination. It is common to hear mines being improperly labeled as shafts. A shaft is a vertical mine entrance that is similar to an elevator, which hauls equipment, men, pumps water out of the mine, and sometimes simply air into the underlying workings below. The tunnel started to be dug out on June 25th of 1864. Instead of mine cars pulling dirt and rock out, the Federal troops used old cracker boxes and used muscle power for everything. A nearby bridge was deconstructed for its wooden timbers and used to support the roof and walls of the mine. The mine tunnel was even ventilated. The tunnel was 586 feet in distance, and it came to a T, meaning that the mine went straight in and then went from left to right when encountering the enemy line itself. After the tunnel was finished in late July, 8,000 pounds of powder were placed in the tunnel, and sandbags were placed at the tunnel entrance so the maximum force of the explosion would do its most damage. Unluckily for the Southern troops, they had heard the digging under their feet but never could find the source. They gave up looking for a possible enemy tunnel after the noises had stopped. But by this time, the tunnel was already complete. The plan of attack was supposed to be simple. However, everything is simple on paper, except when enacted and put into motion. The Federal troops were to blow a hole directly under the line of Confederate troops at Pegram's Salient, create a physical hole in the rebel line from the mine explosion, and charge through the Confederate line. Hopefully, the rebels would be stunned by the thousands of pounds of powder that had just blasted through their lines and would shell shock them. In their confusion, the Union, black troops adequately trained for such an event, would muster quickly and pour through their defenses like locusts. It all sounded simple yet brilliant an idea, but execution and timing would be everything. If properly managed and carried out, the Union would secure the higher ground above Petersburg and could pound the enemy into submission and end the Petersburg siege quicker. The fuses of 8,000 pounds of explosives were placed into the explosive powder by Union Federal forces directly under the feet of Confederate forces. Fellow Americans, though considered rebels and thus the enemy, were about to be blown straight to the Almighty. Little did the unfortunate rebels know that 278 of them would be killed in an instant in an unimaginably violent, earth-shattering, horrific explosion. This tactic would not be implemented again until many years later in the Great War, when British troops dug a similar tunnel under German trenches, detonating a tunnel similar to the one in Virginia in 1864. The World War I attack would kill 10,000 Germans instantly. One could deduce that the British had learned this tactic from the Battle of the Crater. At 04:45 hours on July 30th, 1864, after an unnecessary delay in getting the fuses lit, the charges under the Confederates were exploded. At precisely 4:44, there was, according to a soldier from the 20th Michigan,
a heaving and lifting of the fort and the hill on which it stood. Then a monstrous tongue of flame shot fully 200 feet in the air, followed by a vast column of white smoke. Then a great spout or fountain of red earth rose to a great height, mingled with men and guns, timbers and planks, and every other kind of debris, all ascending, spreading, whirling, scattering.
Men were thrown violently from their earthworks. Undoubtedly body parts of all sorts, rifles, cannons, and personal soldiers' items were thrown in every direction. In the words of a Maine soldier,
the sky was filled with earth, stones, timbers, arms, legs, guns, unlimbered, and bodies unlimbed.
Those that were either wounded, shocked, or in surrounding areas were in utter dismay. The Union would have to move in quick and seize the advantage of shock and awe by advancing through the hole they had created in the Confederate line. By any delay in getting troops to assault through the enemy objective, less surprise would be gained and Federal casualties would likely mount in response. This is exactly what would unfortunately happen to Union forces. The attack was held off for over 20 minutes. The incompetence of the Union attackers would be a godsend for the battered rebels, for the Federal troops were like shooting fish in a barrel after being trapped in their own doing. Many Federal troops that were to soon enter the crater itself were to never exit it alive. A reason as to why the Union charged into the crater was that the Yankees showed some compassion for the entrapped Confederates that were crushed by the earth surrounding them. Some attempted to help free their enemies and became bogged down in the giant hole. The Confederates by this point brought their cannons to the edge of the crater and literally blasted the shells into the Federal troops at point-blank range. What a horrific, haunting sight this must have been. The Union troops were supposed to bypass the crater itself, but confusion set in and they entered it. A historian sums up the plight of being pinned down in lower ground, surrounded by the rebel enemy.
Whenever the 1st Division attempted to advance out of the crater, they were soon met by intense fire from the Confederate infantry, which had by then recovered its composure after the explosion and bombardment, as well as the rebel artillery, which had found the range on the Federals in the crater. Many were hit not only from the exposed flanks, but also from the rear, as the Confederates reoccupied the transverses and the entrenchments to the right and left of the crater. These men had recovered their equanimity, and when the Union attempted to reform on the Confederate side of the crater, the rebels faced about and delivered a fire into the backs of the Federals. Coming so unexpectedly, this caused the forming line to fall back into the crater.
A first-hand account from a Confederate soldier sheds light on the crater counterattack waged by the surprised but determined Confederates. Although a lengthy quote published in 1895, George Clark mentions the black soldiers fighting in the crater.
On reaching the works, the real fight began. Our men poured over into the crater. In the ring of steel, in bayonet and hand-to-hand fight began. Men were brained by butts of guns and run through with bayonets. The brave Saunders, who sleeps in Hollywood, had a regular duel with a big Negro soldier, and both proved bad marksmen. Adjutant Von Vale of the 14th Alabama, the bravest soldier ever under fire, was killed by a Negro soldier. So was Lieutenant John W. Cole of the 11th Alabama, and many other brave officers and men. This melee kept up for at least 15 minutes. The enemy fired with desperation because they were impressed with the idea that no quarter would be given. The credit of capturing the crater and all its contents belongs to Morgan Smith Cleveland, the adjutant of the 8th Alabama Regiment, who now fills a patriot's grave at Selma, Alabama. I am told that his grave is unmarked, if not unknown, and that he was buried by charity, and I hang my head in humiliation if this information is true. Morgan Cleveland was as humane and tender as he was brave. Standing in the crater, in the midst of this horrid carnage, with almost bursting heart, he said to a Federal colonel who was near him, "Why in the hell don't you fellows surrender?" And he put the accent on the cuss word. The Yankee replied quickly, "Why in the hell don't you let us?" A wink being as good as a nod, either to a blind horse or brave soldier. The effect was instantaneous. The enemy threw down their arms, marched out as prisoners, some being killed or wounded by their own cannon as they filed past where I stood, and the day was saved as a glorious heritage for the Southern soldier and those who come after him. I remember helping General Bartlett of Boston, I think Bartlett was his name, who was trying to get out on 2 muskets inverted and use his crutches. I could see no evidence of physical pain in his face, and remarked to him that he must have nerves of steel, as his leg was shot away. He smiled and replied that he had lost his rear leg at Williamsburg 2 years before, and the leg he had just shattered was a colt leg.
The situation was undoubtedly fierce. Hand-to-hand combat is the worst-case scenario for any soldier during any type of conflict in any era of warfare. Desperation, instinct, and brutality take over when men stab and beat other men to death. One can easily imagine that the black soldiers pinned down in the blasted-out crater would have been treated much harsher than the white Union soldiers that were killed and were taken prisoner that day. However, according to Confederate veterans' first-hand accounts, the black troops were the ones that initially decried no quarter as they met the rebels in the crater.
By that time it was light enough to see a considerable distance, and our man could be seen running rapidly to the rear, and the whole field in front full of Yankees and Negroes charging up to the crater. The great burly Negroes in the ill-fitting uniforms, half drunk it was said, were shouting at the top of their voices, "No quarter to the rebels! No quarter to the rebels!" and butchering every man they found alive in the works. The soldiers who fought in that battle will never forget it. That dreadful shout, "No quarter," from the Negro troops rang in our ears for days afterwards. We plainly saw the position we were in. To be captured by the Negro troops meant death not only to ourselves, but it appeared to the helpless women and children in Petersburg.
Another Confederate soldier remarked about the African American slaughter at the crater, stating,
About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a detail was made to send for water. And while waiting for its return, General Mahone walked in front of the line and told us that the Negroes in the crater had hollered, "Remember Fort Pillow, no quarters." The slaughter was terrible. The soldiers were excited. They were reckless. They burst the Negroes' skulls with the butts of their guns like eggshells. The officers tried to prevent it, but they were powerless. It was no quarter for the rebels that morning, and it was no quarter for them now. The fight was soon ended.
More Confederate veterans of the battle remarked that
A large excavation was made, and in the smoke and confusion, amid the flying debris and mangled men, the enemy charged in great force, effecting a lodgment in our lines, and a large number of flags of Burnside's corps floated on our works. Reinforcements poured to their support, and a vigorous assault was made on our line on both sides of the crater. In the van were Negro soldiers crying, "No quarter to the rebels."
a final first-hand quote on the slaughter of the African American troops shows just how savage the fighting was and how the soldiers literally used everything at their disposal to kill their enemies.
In the fort, the enemy were crowded but undaunted by numbers. Our boys commenced scaling the sides of the fort. The enemy kept up such a fire that it seemed like a second Vesuvius belching forth its fire. Then came the tug of war. The enemy have shouted, "No quarters." We then gave them what they justly deserved. There, we were on one side of the walls of the fort and the Yankees on the other. The fight was the bloodiest of the war considering numbers engaged. We fought with muskets, with bayonets, with rocks, and even with clods of dirt. The fight lasted in this manner for near half an hour. When they called for quarters, and we being sickened by the slaughter, as well as awfully tired of the fight, granted them quarters. All that we had not killed surrendered, and I must say we took some of the Negroes prisoners.
What a hellish event this was for all involved. This was mankind at its worst. The rebels would owe the day's victory to a fast-thinking Confederate Major General, William Mahone. The only thing that would turn out in the Union's favor that day was the actual explosion itself. Even that was questionable due to the large crater that would ultimately become a slaughterhouse for the unfortunate Federals charging foolishly into it. Instead of going around the actual crater, which was roughly 30 feet deep, the Federals charged into the crater itself and became stuck in the dirt and thick clay leading out of the crater. Unit after unit filed into this pit, which is about 200 feet wide, and became easy targets for the vengeful rebels who held the higher ground. It literally became a turkey shoot. The black troops that were to have initially led the attack were the only Union troops that had rehearsed for the attack that was to have followed the tunnel explosion. However, Grant, Meade, and other generals earlier had decided to not have the black soldiers lead the assault out of fear of high casualty rates and an outcry from the American public for using these black soldiers as Confederate target practice. In the end, these men were told to stand down and let another unit lead the assault. Ironically, the black troops would have to fight and were sent in last. The black troops also had the highest casualties of anyone on that battlefield that day. General Ledlie, leader of the first troops to charge Confederate lines, was accused as being drunk during the time of the attack and even did not take it upon himself and his subordinates to train for the assault on the rebel lines. This would explain why his troops delayed their assault and simply ran straight into the crater and were cut down by the enemy. Communication was poor at best for the Federal troops. Burnside was ordered at 0930 to call off the attack and retreat, but the men fighting in the crater did not learn of this until 3 hours later at 12:30. It is believed that Burnside ignored Grant's order for the men to fall back. Communication is crucial in any war and engagement. If the men had learned of the order to retreat, even though they were surrounded, more Union men would have possibly survived and would not have been taken as prisoners of war. The fog of war cares nothing for wishful, well-intentioned thinking. Hindsight bias is always 20/20. We will not know what was going through Burnside and Meade's head that day. General Burnside would not survive the outcome of this battle with his pride and military record in check. After the battle's disaster and the slaughter of his men in and around the crater site, he would be relieved of command. General Burnside, Meade, and Brigadier Generals Ledlie, Ferrero, and Orlando B. Wilcox, and Colonel Zenas R. Bliss were all brought up on charges and censured. Later down the road, Burnside would be spared some of the blame, and Meade would be under the public spotlight for his incompetence during the battle. The damage was done for General Burnside, however, and he would never return to soldiering. Visitors to this hallowed ground can still see evidence of the horror that took place on that July day. The ground is encircled by trees and gentle rolling hills with potholes in them, are all that remain of the horrific site of the explosion. If one did not know of the bloody events that took place back in 1864, they might not ever know that the hills and crater were man-made. The crater site is covered in grass, and one can even venture into the entrance of the tunnel itself that was behind Union lines. The mine tunnel goes in for a short distance until the roof blocks the tunnel from the cave-in, and the mine is gated at the entrance. Every year, the tunnel is opened up at the entrance from its gate, and people can peer inside. It is a tad bit macabre, but people should understand what transpired there that day and what war pushes men to do against other men. Luckily, sites like this have been spared from progress and land development. There are body parts of men scattered all throughout the area, which makes it a gravesite. Instead of the sounds of shells screaming overhead and bullets passing through the air, hopefully the only sounds that will take place there are birds whistling and people's gentle conversations on what they are witnessing at the crater site in front of them. The battle was an overwhelming Confederate victory. The Federal tunnel digging and explosion was sheer genius, however. The vision factor goes to the Northerners for a brilliant idea to break a prolonged siege. The tunnel was brilliantly put together, planned, and blasted successfully directly under the feet of the enemy. If only the explosion was continued with a proper assault through the enemy line, then the Union would have ended the Petersburg siege 8 months earlier, and more men on both sides would have been spared an untimely death. Possibly even the war would have ended sooner in response to a successful Northern victory at the crater. Instead, over 6,000 men would die in and around the crater that day, most casualties being Union and Black. Sadly, today, not much of the actual crater battle site has been preserved. According to a prominent Civil War preservation group, civilwar.org, 2 acres has been preserved for future generations to visit and reflect upon. Like many Civil War battle sites, acre after acre is being destroyed by human development and the inevitable progress. According to the History Channel, over 1,000 acres of former American Civil War battlegrounds are being destroyed every day. They and others are attempting to preserve what little is left of these important sites. We cannot neglect and forget our past, for when it's gone forever.